Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, December 22nd, 2023. President Joe Biden pardons thousands of Americans convicted of using or possessing marijuana on some federal lands and commutes the sentence of 11 nonviolent drug offenders. We'll have details in just a moment. United Nations Security Council approves a resolution calling for pauses in the war between Israel and Hamas to allow more humanitarian aid to reach the people of Gaza. It ends a week of negotiations during which the United States wanted changes in the language in exchange for not vetoing the resolution. Today's vote was 13-0, with the U.S. and Russia abstaining. The Biden administration says the proposed $14 billion sale of U.S. steel to a Japanese firm deserves serious scrutiny by a U.S. government committee that reviews the national security implications of foreign investments into U.S. companies. We'll talk about this review and the politics of this issue with Bloomberg News White House correspondent Josh Wingrove. And former President Donald Trump responds to the Colorado Supreme Court decision keeping him off the presidential primary ballot for having engaged in insurrection. A story in USA Today, President Joe Biden announced Friday he's issuing a federal pardon to every American who has used marijuana in the past, including those who were never arrested or prosecuted. The sweeping pardon applies to all U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents in possession of marijuana for their personal use and those convicted of similar federal crimes. It also forgives pot users in the District of Columbia. It does not apply to individuals who have been jailed for selling the drug, which is illegal under federal law, or other marijuana offenses, such as driving under the influence of an illegal substance. That's USA Today reporting. The pardons do not apply to people who violated state law either, the president urging governors to pardon them. Anyone who wants to receive proof of a pardon will have to apply through the Department of Justice. The president today also commuting the sentences of 11 people he said are serving disproportionately long sentences for nonviolent drug offenses and would have received lesser sentences if they were charged today. Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, Democrat of Florida, posting, "Thank you, President Biden, for today's needed action to address the flawed justice system that criminalizes marijuana possession, something that disproportionately impacts Black Americans. This will lift barriers for those pardoned to access employment and educational opportunities." Now to the war in the Middle East. From Associated Press, after many delays, the United Nations Security Council adopted a watered-down resolution Friday, calling for immediately speeding up aid deliveries to desperate civilians in Gaza, but without the original call for an urgent suspension of hostilities between Israel and Hamas. The vote in the 15-member council was 13-0, with the United States and Russia abstaining. It followed a U.S. veto of a Russian amendment that would have restored the call for a suspension of hostilities. That vote was 10 members in favor, the U.S. against, and 4 abstentions. The revised text was negotiated during a week and a half of high-level diplomacy by the United States, the United Arab Emirates, on behalf of Arab nations, and others. That article from Associated Press. U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield spoke after the final vote.
This was tough, but we got there. Since the start of this conflict, the United States has worked tirelessly to alleviate this humanitarian crisis, to get life-saving assistance into Gaza and to get hostages out of Gaza, to push for the protection of innocent civilians and humanitarian workers, and to work towards a lasting peace. Today's vote bolsters those efforts and lends support to our direct diplomacy. And I want to thank the UAE and others for working with us in good faith to craft a strong humanitarian-focused resolution. It took many days and many long nights of negotiating to get this right. But today, this council provided a glimmer of hope amongst a sea of unimaginable suffering. Today, this council called for urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access, and to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. I'll note that this is the first time this council has used this language we believe is critical to scaling up aid and underscoring the tough steps ahead as we work together to achieve a lasting peace. Colleagues, today this Council made clear that addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza needs to remain at the forefront of our agenda. Today this Council made clear that all hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally, and that humanitarian groups must be able to access hostages, including for medical visits. Today, this Council made clear that all parties must respect international humanitarian law. Today, this Council made clear that civilian and humanitarian facilities, including hospitals, medical facilities, schools, places of worship, and UN facilities, as well as humanitarian personnel and medical personnel, must be protected. This applies to all parties to this conflict, to Israel, but also to Hamas, a terror group that instigated this conflict and that wages war from inside homes and hospitals and UN sites and uses innocent civilians as human shields, an act of cowardice and cruelty.
U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Linda Thomas-Greenfield at the Security Council meeting in New York City. As mentioned before the final resolution passed, Russia's ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, offered an amendment to make the language call for suspension of hostilities between Israel and Hamas, and the ambassador criticized the U.S. for the negotiations that lasted a week.
The United States, under various pretexts, has been dragging out the negotiating process, deviating from the normal, transparent negotiating work. Instead of this, they have resorted to their favored tactic of gross pressure, blackmail, and twisting arms so that at the last minute they'll be able to present the members of the Council with an ultimatum. Either the Council adopts a text that is convenient for Washington, or the United States will once again block the adoption of any product. The draft that is now being put to a vote was initially, in our view, entirely toothless. But respecting the initiative of our Arab colleagues and their needs, we were ready to support it under pressure from the USA that essentially intercepted the authorship and usurped work on the text behind the scenes at various levels, twisting the hands of those in the region. With each new drafting, the text lost more and more important provisions. Ultimately, the wording that is being put to a vote today has been extremely neutered, including its OP4 on the mechanism that would be supposed to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza and ensure its monitoring. But worse than all of that, through the efforts of the American delegation, the draft resolution has included an extremely dangerous element for the future of Gaza. Instead of the wording on an immediate cessation of violence in OP2, an ambiguous phrase has appeared calling for the parties to create conditions for a cessation of hostilities. Colleagues, destruction or displacement or the exile of the population of Gaza in a cynical reading, and that is precisely how it is going to be read in Israel, would also create the conditions for a cessation of hostilities. By signing off on this, the Council would essentially be giving the Israeli armed forces complete freedom of movement for further clearing of the Gaza Strip, and anyone who votes in favor of the text as it is currently worded would bear responsibility for that, essentially becoming complicit in the destruction of Gaza. Moreover, the text of the draft has lost a reference to condemnations of all indiscriminate attacks on civilians. What signal does this send to the international community? That the Security Council is giving Israel a green light for war crimes?
Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, at the UN Security Council. The amendment he offered was vetoed by the United States. Again, from Associated Press about the resolution that did pass today. On a key sticking point concerning aid deliveries, the new draft eliminates a previous request for the UN to exclusively monitor all humanitarian relief consignments to Gaza, provided through land, sea, and air routes by outside parties to confirm their humanitarian nature. It substitutes a request to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to expeditiously appoint a senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator with responsibility for facilitating, coordinating, monitoring, and verifying whether relief deliveries to Gaza that are not from the parties to the conflict are humanitarian goods. The resolution that passed was sponsored by United Arab Emirates, and its ambassador, Lana Nusabe, gave a statement.
The purpose of this text is very simple. It responds with action to the dire humanitarian situation on the ground for the Palestinian people, bearing the brunt of this conflict, while protecting those who are trying to deliver life-saving aid. And it demands the urgent release of the hostages and for humanitarian access to address their medical needs. The draft reaffirms that we are building on the important Resolution 2712 and its provisions. It demands that the parties to the conflict allow and facilitate the use of all available routes to the Gaza Strip for the provision of humanitarian assistance. What this means is that all possible land, sea and air routes into Gaza must be utilized to allow life-saving aid to enter. This includes ensuring that the Kerem Shalom, Kerem Abu Salem crossing remains open in full with this Council's backing. But even if trucks are going in at scale, if deconfliction does not happen, aid simply cannot reach those who need it. Current deconfliction efforts are clearly not working if 136 UN workers have lost their lives because of it. This is why the text reaffirms that UN and humanitarian personnel, premises and consignments are protected and must not be attacked, a vital principle of international humanitarian law that has been repeatedly violated in this conflict. The text also calls for urgent steps to allow unhindered and critically expanded humanitarian access, and it also calls on the parties to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. We know this is not a perfect text. We know only a ceasefire will end this suffering, and that is why the UAE put a resolution to the vote in this Council on Friday, 8th December. Unfortunately, it failed to pass. On 12th December, 153 countries called for this in the General Assembly. Again, a ceasefire did not happen as a result of this call, although its significance in its moral clarity is clear. The resolution the UAE has put in blue this morning responds to the calls for a sustainable cessation of hostilities and a massive scale-up of humanitarian aid. Often, in diplomacy, the challenge is meeting the moment in the world we live in, not in the world that we want, and we will never tire in pushing for a full humanitarian ceasefire.
United Arab Emirates Ambassador to the United Nations, Lana Nusabe, at the Security Council meeting today. Again, this resolution passed 13-0. The U.S. and Russia abstained. A story from CNN, Israel indicated Friday that it is widening its military operation in Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces on Friday ordered the residents of a refugee camp and several other areas in central Gaza to move to shelters for safety, signaling a new focus of the ground offensive. The military operation had so far been largely focused on northern Gaza and parts of the southern side of the Strip. And Israeli military officials have said they believe they are close to defeating Hamas militants in the group's last remaining strongholds in northern Gaza. This is Washington Today. President Biden today signing an executive order giving the Treasury Department the authority to target financial institutions that help Russia's defense industries. The U.S. estimates that Russia has lost, in almost 2 years of fighting in Ukraine, over 13,000 pieces of military equipment, including tanks, missiles, and drones. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the executive order will continue tightening the screws on Russia's war machine and its enablers. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg spoke about the war in Ukraine in a year-end video holiday message.
Hello to all our service members from across the alliance. We live in a more dangerous world. There is a fully fledged war in Europe, a new war in the Middle East. Tensions in the Western Balkans are increasing. Brutal terrorism persists, and climate change is driving conflicts. There can be no security without strong defenses, and no strong defenses without capable armed forces. That is why this past year we took significant steps to further bolster NATO's deterrence and defense. With more troops on high readiness and increased defense spending, This is not to provoke a war. It is to prevent conflict and preserve peace. This past year, I had the privilege to meet many of you. I met with troops who are part of the NATO battle group in Estonia. I saw you exercising in Lithuania, met with sailors patrolling the Mediterranean and protecting critical infrastructure in the North Sea. I met the troops supporting those made homeless by the devastating earthquake in Turkey. And just last month, I met KFOR troops in northern Kosovo, helping maintain a safe and secure environment for all in Kosovo is key for the stability of the wider Western Balkans region. I want to take this opportunity to thank each of you, wherever you are deployed. Without you, there will be no NATO, no security, and no freedom. We owe you a debt of gratitude. So thank you for your service, your professionalism and commitment. And I wish you and your families a peaceful holiday and a happy new year.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in a video posted at the NATO website. From the Guardian newspaper in Britain, the Kremlin has threatened Europe and the U.S. with serious consequences, including tit-for-tat financial seizures or even a break in diplomatic relations if Russian assets held abroad are given to aid the Ukrainian budget and war effort. A spokesperson for Vladimir Putin told reporters on Friday that if the Biden administration and European leaders plan to seize Russian central bank assets believed to be in excess of $300 billion that were frozen after Moscow launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, they should realize that Russia will never leave those who do it alone. White House National Economic Advisor Lael Brainerd on Thursday night put out a statement saying that the proposed sale of U.S. Steel to a Japanese company for $14 billion appears to deserve serious scrutiny. This comes after several U.S. senators, both Democrats and Republicans, have outright criticized the sale. Senator John Fetterman, Democrat from Pennsylvania, was interviewed by News Nation on Wednesday.
Shock and anger. It was just absolutely astonished. I live directly across the street from the steel mill and the Union Hall, and I've always had a really great relationship with the management from Burritt all the way down, and I was stunned. And then when I found out that they also didn't tell the union either, I just really thought there must be something in play, and it must be they don't have to care about what happens to the union or a relationship with myself, and there perhaps is a really, really large golden kind of parachute. I don't know.
You're obviously losing a big employer in your state and a manufacturer, but there are other senators who've brought up concerns about national security. So I'm wondering...
No, actually, I was the first person to bring that up. I'm not sure who else did that. I've been saying this for years. I'm not and it's, for me, steel is national security. It's economic security for the workers, for our communities. And I realize that Japan is a great ally, but I just believe that steel should remain American-owned, made in American by union workers.
So do you know what the path would be to potentially prevent the deal from moving forward as you've expressed?
I don't know exactly what that is, but I can promise how much vocal and how hard I'm going to try to work to derail that and hold them accountable for what they've decided to do, and not even talk about the union or even talk about this publicly at all, saying, hey, what does this think? They didn't, so they must not have thought that it wasn't something most people were going to be approve of.
Senator John Fetterman, Democrat from Pennsylvania, in a News Nation interview on Wednesday. More on the proposed sale of U.S. Steel to a Japanese company. Joining us on the phone is Josh Wingrove, White House correspondent for Bloomberg News. Thanks for being with us. The White House put out a statement from economic advisor Lael Brainerd that supports looking further into the sale, but doesn't come right out and oppose it like many senators have. How do we interpret that?
Yeah, we've been waiting for them to weigh in on this because this was a big surprise on Monday, right? No one had really been expecting this Japanese company to be the winning bid for U.S. Steel, which had been exploring a sale for some time, and it was a heck of a bid. You know, the $14 billion offer price is more than some analysts thought would be the case, and so this thing just sort of dropped, and everyone in Washington has been sort of trying to figure out what they want to say about it and what they don't. And so Joe Biden had been fairly silent on it. Monday was an anniversary of the death of his wife and daughter 51 years ago, so he was not, in Washington that day. But we've been sort of like waiting to see what they would say. And as things have ticked on, people have ratcheted up their positions. Some senators initially didn't call for a review or to be blocked, and then upped the ante and decided to, and that includes both senators for Pennsylvania, Bob Casey and John Fetterman. Other senators are quiet on it. A few Republicans, but only a few, have called for CFIUS to block it. So it kind of depends on who you ask and what you ask. What's at stake here is what's called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's this very secretive panel that typically would look into things like, say, China buying a high-tech company or someone buying land next to a Air Force base or that kind of thing. It's for national security threats. So the question is, well, does that really apply here? And that's still a question that's hanging in the air. So Biden is saying it should be looked at. It's going to be looked at by CFIUS, this group, which is led by the Treasury Department. It's a very secretive process. This will be all be behind closed doors, and then we'll see what will happen from there. But if CFIUS ultimately decides to intervene on this deal, that'll be a big change. Again, it'll be sort of the latest development of the U.S., including under President Trump, but now under President Biden, treating the steel sector as a sort of strategic industry, a national security question, as opposed to just sort of another commodity, another factory, and deserving of special attention. And that would be the case to sort of intervene here. Does CFIUS operate independent of the White House? It's a panel, but it is chaired by his Treasury Secretary. So if the question is, can Joe Biden weigh in on the CFIUS process, the administration's view will certainly be part of it. But, we don't really know. And sometimes they rule that they don't have jurisdiction. That, in fact, happened earlier this year in another CFIUS case in North Dakota where they tried to, intervene on something and seemed like they even might have wanted to, but decided they couldn't have jurisdiction. So this could come down a lot of different ways. And one of those ways is that it goes forward with some conditions. For instance, maybe they have to commit to certain union hiring provisions, because that's a big part of this as well. U.S. Steel is, of course, connected pretty closely to the United Steel Workers, the union representing a lot of the workers in the steel sector in the U.S. And Biden has aligned himself heavily with the union movement, including the USW in particular, and they have a lot of concerns about this deal. And so I think when thinking about where Biden will land on this, it's very helpful, if not instructive entirely, to just look at where the union is pressing for it, because he often calls union groups sort of the one that brought him to the ball, and it's hard to see him breaking from them on such a high-profile, sort of iconic company, although one, admittedly, that has been in more distress in recent years than its heyday generations ago. We're talking with Josh Wingrove from Bloomberg News. What is the economic versus the political significance of a sale of U.S. Steel? It's both. Economically, the question for Biden and for the intervention is what happens if foreign companies own a bunch of your steel mills, and what happens if, for instance, you get another pandemic-like event that throws supply chains up in the air. So that's the question. Should we have domestic production in the U.S., sort of guaranteed, locked-in, American, and not have to worry about shocks and supplies? So that's that question. But the broader political question is, do you want to be in an election year in Pennsylvania, which is an essential swing state where U.S. Steel is based, either explaining why you allowed the sale of the company or explaining why you didn't allow the sale of the company? We've seen these Pennsylvania lawmakers come up pretty strongly against it. It's pretty clear that they don't think that would be good politics or good policy for them. And so we'll see where that goes. As the Republican primary goes on, if Donald Trump sort of coalesces what right now is a polling lead into a sort of commanding lead in early states and becomes the nominee or the de facto nominee, then this could come up there as well. And then you could have sort of a war of words between Biden and Trump yet again if we're headed for that rematch over the steel sector and the steps that each of them have taken to defend it. Trump added tariffs to protect the sector. Biden has kept those in place but focused more on the health of the unions, of the workers, than necessarily of, tariffs that would benefit the company necessarily. So that's been the sort of divide on it. But there's politics on this, there's economics on this. But at the end of the day, the question is, do you want an allied country's company or company based in an allied country, Japan, to own steel? Or do you think steel is deserving of special protection, special status, and maybe should remain American-owned? That's the crux of it.
Josh Wingrove covers the White House and the economy for Bloomberg News. You can find his stories at Bloomberg.com and on X, formerly Twitter, Josh_Wingrove. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wall Street today, the Dow down 18, NASDAQ up 29, S&P up 7. New government data, writes NBC News, showed prices notching a monthly decline for the first time since April 2020. Adding to an improving picture on inflation as the new year looms. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, PCE, one of the two major readings on inflation, fell by 0.1% between October and November, the Bureau of Economic Analysis said Friday, the first monthly decline in more than 3.5 years. Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, has released his 9th annual Festivus report, which highlights, he says, about $900 billion of wasteful government spending. Some of the highlights, according to Senator Paul: National Institutes of Health spending a portion of $2.7 million to study Russian cats walking on a treadmill and Barbies used as proof of ID for receiving COVID Paycheck Protection Program funds. Department of Defense ruining over $169 million worth of military equipment by leaving it outside. And the Small Business Administration struggling, in quotes, music artists like Post Malone, Chris Brown, and Lil Wayne over $200 million. The Christmas holiday travel rush is on. Associated Press writes U.S. airlines are predicting a blockbuster holiday season and have projected confidence they can handle the crowds after hiring thousands of pilots, flight attendants, and other workers seeking to avoid the delays and suspensions that marred travel last year. The Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg posting a video with tips if you are flying.
If you're planning to take a flight this holiday, here are some things that you should know. This year, we have seen some of the busiest air travel days in U.S. history. And so far, this year, our aviation system has been handling the increased volume well. In fact, cancellations are lower than they were before the pandemic, and we're pushing hard to keep it that way. But if your flight does get delayed or canceled, know that the Department of Transportation has your back. For example, we have secured enforceable commitments from the 10 largest airlines to cover expenses for things like rebooking, meals, and more when you face delays or cancellations that are the airline's responsibility. You should also know that you are entitled to a full cash refund if your flight is canceled for any reason. And our work as a watchdog has helped get over $2.5 billion returned from airlines to travelers. And if you're traveling with children, more airlines are now offering fee-free family seating, something that we are pushing to implement across the board. So, before you travel this holiday, take a moment to visit flightrights.gov. Know your rights and what to expect as a passenger, and know that the Department of Transportation is here to support you.
Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg in a video. Washington Today continues in a moment.
We want to take a minute to ask for your help. Your financial support will ensure that C-SPAN can continue to produce podcasts that inform you about national politics, introduce you to the latest nonfiction books, and provide valuable historical context to today's news. Make a donation today and be a part of C-SPAN's future. Visit c-span.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. The Detroit News reported on Thursday about what it says is a recording of a phone call from November 2020 with former President Donald Trump and Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel pressuring two Michigan election officials not to certify Joe Biden's victory in the state in the presidential election. C-SPAN spoke this morning to University of Baltimore law professor Kimberly Whaley.
And I wanted to start with the breaking news about a Michigan call. So this is being reported by the Detroit News. I've got the Hill here that says recordings reportedly show Trump pressuring Michigan canvassers to not certify the 2020 vote. What is that going to mean? What do we know so far?
Well, we know that this is new information and that it sounds like, and I'm not 100% on the reporting, but it sounds like Jack Smith, the special counsel, didn't have this information when the Justice Department transferred stuff to Michigan relating to Donald Trump and the election in the state of Michigan. But the question here, it's similar to what happened in Georgia, which produced an indictment, the famous now call asking where Donald Trump pressured, allegedly, well, we have the audio tape, Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, to find enough votes to take that column from Joe Biden, that is the state of Georgia, and move it into Donald Trump's column that produced this sweeping indictment, other issues in Georgia. So the question would be, is that a violation of Michigan law to have basically asked people that are counting ballots to not do their due diligence, not do their public service, and actually put that number in the column that the voters chose? Very early to tell, but it could produce some more legal jeopardy potentially for Donald Trump and others that were, sounds like, potentially involved in that transaction.
University of Baltimore law professor Kimberly Whaley on C-SPAN's morning program, The Washington Journal. Michigan's Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson reacted on CNN Thursday night.
This is really extraordinary. I mean, I wasn't aware until Craig's reports that this recording existed. It's quite extraordinary. We had a gut feeling and had lots of different pieces of evidence to suggest that this was happening. So I wasn't surprised by anything that was revealed or any of the revelations in the recording. It does, underscore the fact that there is evidence that the former president did actively try to pressure local officials to block their the certification of a fair and legitimate election. And it brought back all of the memories of that moment, which for me was in the night of the Wayne County Board of Canvasser certification was one of the lowest moments for me of the entire post-election process, because we knew if Wayne County didn't certify, and that's where Detroit is in Michigan, then that would delay certification for the entire state. And then that could potentially delay or confuse certification in all of the battleground states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, because we were going first. And then if that happened, that opens it up for state legislatures to then override election results and allocate the state electors to perhaps then President Trump, opening the slate of electors, the false slate of electors to come in and then be accepted by Congress on January 6th. So it was all this plan that we knew could unfold in that direction. And it all began that night in the Wayne County Board of Canvassers meeting.
Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, a Democrat, on CNN. The Donald Trump presidential campaign put out a statement. All of President Trump's actions were taken in furtherance of his duty as President of the United States to faithfully take care of the laws and ensure election integrity, including investigating the rigged and stolen 2020 presidential election. And Republican National Committee Chair Ronna McDaniel telling the Detroit News, "What I said publicly and repeatedly at the time, as referenced in my letter on November 21st, 2020, is that there was ample evidence that warranted an audit." Donald Trump was interviewed today on the Hugh Hewitt radio program for about a half hour, and one of the first topics was the candidate's legal issues and this week's Colorado Supreme Court decision saying that Donald Trump cannot be on the state's election ballot because he engaged in insurrection during the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol in violation of the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment.
Mr. President, I'm not going to talk to you about the trials on which you are under an order not to speak because...
the Biden trials. Biden trials.
I consider those orders to be...
People have to understand these are all Biden trials. These were all inspired by and pushed by DOJ. So this is somebody attacking a political opponent like never before. Every single trial is a Biden trial.
And I believe they're unconstitutional. I think those orders are unconstitutional. They're broad. They're overly broad. I think they're vague. They'll be reversed. But we can talk about the Colorado case. I think that is a joke, the biggest joke I've seen from the state court ever. Have you already appealed it?
We're in the process of doing it. Everybody thinks exactly what you're saying. They're trying to take the election away from the voters. And this is the same group. I guess it's Crew. I've beaten them about 20 times. I beat them on emoluments. They sue me on anything. It's a group of radical left lunatics, and they sue anytime they can. And this one is really a crazy one. And if they ever did that, it would be so bad for this country. You have no idea. And you understand it would be a big problem for the country.
Oh, I think it will be a 9-0 reversal. I hope it comes today. But I wanted to make sure you appeal.
I think that's the kind of a reversal. It should not be given any credit, not even the credit of one Supreme Court justice.
I agree.
Donald Trump, former president and 2024 Republican presidential candidate on the Hugh Hewitt radio show. News from the Supreme Court today denying the request from special counsel Jack Smith to expedite the consideration of whether Donald Trump has presidential immunity from prosecution for his actions in trying to allegedly overturn his loss in the 2020 presidential election. His trial on those charges from the special counsel begins in just a few months. President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden visited Washington's Children's National Hospital today ahead of the Christmas holiday. They've done so every year since President Biden took office. Spectrum News has a story on this. Annual visits to the hospital by the First Lady are a holiday tradition dating back more than 80 years to Bess Truman, the wife of former President Harry Truman. Some members of Congress have been posting their holiday greetings.
My name is Gabe Amo, Congressman for Rhode Island's 1st District in the U.S. House of Representatives. This holiday season, I share the gratitude of all Rhode Islanders for your remarkable service to our nation and for the sacrifices that you make each and every day to keep us safe and free. I hope that over the coming weeks, wherever you are, you experience the warmth and love of your friends and family, both near and far. I join my colleagues in Congress and people throughout our country in keeping you in our thoughts. In this season of gratitude and reflection, we are united in our thanks for all that you do for our country. Happy holidays.
Also ahead of Christmas, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, put out a press release that they have issued a transit permit to Mr. S. Nicholas Claus of the North Pole, a distributor with Gifts and Good Cheer Incorporated. The permit will allow reindeer to enter and exit the United States between the hours of 6 p.m. on December 24th, 2023, and 6 a.m. on December 25th, 2023, local time, through or over any U.S. border port. The press release goes on that veterinary officials ensured the reindeer met all entry requirements before issuing the permit. Dr. Rosemary Sifford, USDA's chief veterinary officer, stated, at a recent inspection, the reindeer were found to be healthy and able to prance and paw with each hoof. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word. It is free, and get the stories making headlines in Washington emailed to you every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. And a programming note, there will not be a Washington Today on Christmas Day. We'll return December 26th at 5 p.m. Eastern, and as always, as a podcast. Have a good night, weekend, and holiday.